Hello and welcome to this webcast on Geographic Calculator 2015. This session will be covering the administrative tools found in the application for guiding users, streamlining users, and in general customizing the end user experience when working with things like the geodetic parameter database. The administrative tools in Geographic Calculator 2015 are always working whatever type of data you happen to be working on. If you're working on single coordinates, point databases, vector jobs, or raster data, they're always working behind the scenes with how the end user relates to selection of coordinate transformations, coordinate systems, and even down to the unit selection themselves. By the time we've selected a pair of coordinate systems, such as we have on screen here, NAD27 converting over to NAD83 in a simple lat-long coordinate system, we've already interacted with the database in 3-4 different ways. The admin tools are very often a silent thing to the end user, and that end user experience can be very drastically different depending on how the administrative options are at play. We're going to start off with a simple example here, going from NAD27 to NAD83, to take a look at how things like filters apply. And then we're going to get into some of the more complicated features around customizing how the end user stores their data, where those things are stored, and the settings that can be enabled or disabled to either allow or disallow various permissions to change those settings by the end user. These are going to apply whether you are a single user, so effectively you are your own administrator, or if you are an administrative level user and you're setting up workspaces for large groups that are going to be having modified permissions. So first, we're going to take a look at selecting coordinate systems and a coordinate transformation, and then take a look at exactly what is happening as we do that. So I've already set on screen here an input system of NAD27 and an output system of NAD83. I'm just going to take a look at our output system here quick. We're going to double click on that NAD83 system box, and we have an option to interact with a map or not. So this prompt comes up about do we want to filter the systems based on geographic area. For this, I'm just going to quickly say no, and we're going to take a look at the whole database of coordinate systems that are available. So it opens me back up to the place in the database that I've already set for my input system or output system here of NAD83. You'll notice on the left-hand side of the screen we have a large hierarchy tree of different continents, different countries, with the various coordinate system objects that appear in that subregion. This entire list is customizable. That's the first thing that we're getting from the administrative tools. This appearance of the folders and all of the regional structure and the sub-regional structure of this comes right from the administrative settings in a thing that we refer to as the view file. We are using the view file to interpret the contents of the geodetic data source, and that is a file called geodata.xml. We're going to take a look at where some of these different files actually reside and how our different levels of permissions affect the way we see the contents of those databases. So that's the first piece. The second piece is how we actually select some of these. So just by virtue of being able to see these, I can select these systems as possible inputs or outputs for my data. So the fact that I can see this means I can pick it. And that may sound like a simple thing, but we're going to take a look at filtering these out such that some users will not be able to see the same options that other users might be able to see. So I'm going to just double click my NAD83 system here and return back to my main job. So by the time I've set my input and my output, there are already a number of ways the administrative settings are affecting my choices. And next we're going to take a look at a coordinate transformation. I'm simply going to double click my coordinate transform box in the middle to bring up the list of possible transformations to relate these two coordinate systems to each other. Now, this is automatically going to generate a list for us of ways to connect the dots between these two systems. And in this case, I'm seeing I have two possible transformations coming up for the point that I had entered in. And because the point is near the Canadian border with the US, We're here in the region of Maine. It's going to be over here in the northwest for the northeast for those of you tuning in from another continent. So within this area, we have two possible ways to relate these systems to each other, and it mainly is going to depend on which side of the border we're on, whose standard we're going to be picking. The area of use here tells us exactly where each of these transformations is intended for. You'll see the one in red is indicating that this depends on some extra data that I don't have installed on this particular laptop. This is actually an older transformation that needs to have a grid file added for it that needs to be sourced from the Canadian provincial authorities for that particular transformation. So that's why that one's in red. But I have these two possible choices here. We can see that there are various accuracies. We can see the methods that are used for those transformations, and we can see a verbal description of exactly where those are intended to be used on the planet. Now, if I click on each of these, you'll see it's going to draw on the map for me with this blue polygon. It's going to overlay the polygon of exactly where that transformation is applicable and accurate according to the accuracy that is listed for the transformation. So now let's say, for example, I know this data is fairly well within the state of Maine. So I am the admin user. I know I do not want my users to be able to select that Canadian transformation, even if I do have the grid file stored for it. We're going to take a look at a filtration setting that is going to allow me to hide that from my end users. So I'm just going to back out of here, and we're actually going to step over into the admin panel, and that's going to be found under the options menu as administrative settings. The administrative panel covers four main areas of settings. And in Geographic Calculator 2015, this is something that you're going to see some changes in if you're used to working with the admin panel from any of the previous versions. At 2015, we added a few new settings, and so some of the dialogues simply needed a little more space. We started getting enough settings in place such that it made sense to add a couple of these categories, and so now we have 4 tabs across the top, where there used to actually only be 2. The way this breaks down is the first tab, the General tab, governs simple things like whether or not the end user is going to have access to things like changing the specific workspace that they are working within. They can be forced to use a single restricted workspace. A lot of our larger enterprise customers are actually putting that in place to allow the admins to put a few more locks in place. The locations of the various support files, the data source, the custom data source, and a newer setting that allows us to lock the data path specifically has been put in place. And I'm going to get into what each of those files are in just a minute. We're actually going to hop out of the administrative settings. We're going to go over to the general application preferences. We'll take a look at where those things are, and we'll also take a look at the specific files that are involved in these settings. And then there are settings about whether or not the end user is allowed to edit the contents of their custom database and the various levels of access they have. As well, another newer setting we have is the very bottom setting down here to use user-specific settings for the storage of all of those individual settings that are a part of the workspace. So we're going to hop out of the admin settings here for just a second. We're going to go over to the Preferences dialog, and we're actually going to take a look at the workspace folders that are used to help make some of these make a little bit more sense. So the other place here that is relevant to the admin user is the Preferences dialog. Preferences have also been evolving over the last several releases of the application. For the last couple of releases, there has been a file locations group of preferences. And this is very important if you are an admin level user of the application. This is where we get things like the workspace, the geodetic database, and all of the support files that go along with that database to help enable certain transformations and coordinate systems. The primary setting on here is the specific workspace. So if you are an admin level user and you are trying to have everybody work on a common remotely stored workspace to get the same settings, this is going to be one of the very first things you end up actually putting in place. So the specific workspace on my machine here is pointing to the default location, and this is a non-user specific location. So I'm just going to bring up an Explorer window that I have that actually goes to this location, and we're going to take a look at these side by side so that we can see exactly what we're talking about in all these different locations. So what I'm going to do here is just move these together so that we can see the contents of both of these at the same time. So the workspace by default that ships with the application is called workspace.bmg. That is, again, simply the default out-of-the-box settings. Everything is left wide open for the admin level user to either streamline or put some restrictions in place there. Most folks that are working with an admin locked or modified version of this workspace, chances are you're going to be taking that workspace file and its subfolder of all the jobs and projects, all of the things that it stores. You're going to be placing that most likely on a shared network resource, so maybe a mapped drive. With the workspace, it is actually separate from the geodetic database. And so the data source in the preferences, you'll see main data source and custom data source. Those are two data files that very commonly live together, but they don't need to. Those are going to be found down in our settings directory under this data source menu. So let's just go in there for a minute. There you'll see custom XML. That's going to be where all of your proprietary definitions, your user-defined stuff is going to be stored. And there is geodata.xml. And that is the main data source, the one that comes out of the box with Calculator. That's the one that contains all of your EPSG-based definitions and all of the other things that we ship from Blue Marble as part of the base installation. The next thing on the list in the preferences dialog is the data path. Now the data path is just a storage location where we store things like horizontal grid shift files, for things like, for those of you that are familiar with the NADCON datum transformation method, it requires a lot of grid files to be stored. For those of you familiar with NTV2 datum transformations, those require grid files. Geoids, vertical datum transformations, those all require extra grid files. And so the data path points by default, let's go out to the end of that path there, it points out as a subfolder of the data source path into this subdirectory called shift files. And so in our data source directory, there's that shift files directory. So again, all of these can be moved into separate locations, whether that be local to the end user's machine, or whether those go out to shared mapped drives or network locations, however the admin user wants to set that up. So all of these can be in different places, and the admin tools specifically allow us to lock down the end user's ability to modify where those things are and whether or not they have edit access to those databases. So this is the starting path here under our regular settings directory. So this is going to be down under program data for those of you who are familiar with Windows folder structures. Down under program data, this is a global setting. So all users of the same machine are by default going to share a settings directory with the default workspace and all of the end user preferences, the custom database, and things like that. Now, for those of you who are working on shared machines, so you have one or more people, well, actually two or more people on a single computer with different access to the Geographic Calculator. That is where we get into this new setting of storing these in a user-specific directory. So I'm going to minimize our folder, And I'm going to actually close out of my preferences, and we're going to go back into the administrative settings here. That's this new bottom setting here that says use user settings, and that's actually intended to have a little bit longer wording there. We're going to be changing the caption on that in our service pack coming out this spring. But the user settings specific function, rather than using a directory that is global to all users on the same machine, what that's going to do is instead place that down under the users directory rather than the program data directory. So specifically, that's going to go down under users, app data, roaming. For those of you who are familiar with those storage locations. I suspect a lot of our admin users and our IT users are probably going to know right what I mean there. When the user settings function is turned on, what happens when the user starts up the application is it will go to the global directory, and that's the directory we've just been looking at here. That's going to go down to our global directory, and it's going to find all of those base settings. If they are not already in the user-specific directory, it's going to take the defaults for the application, and it's going to copy those all over to the user-specific directory. So if you are setting this up from an IT standpoint, if you want to pre-configure this, they do need to be set up in that user-specific directory if you want everybody to have a unique experience right off of the starting line, or if you want to set up a default template, it can be done in this global folder here under program data, and then each user will branch into their own specific settings as they interact with the application. So now back in the administrative settings dialog here, we have all of these various settings to lock the location of the current workspace file, the location of both the main data source and the custom data source, and the data path. So typically, if you're going to be setting this up in any kind of a secured environment, most likely you're going to be toggling on at least those first four settings. Now the one key to all of this is the password at the top. So if you want to restrict your user's access to those settings, you can also password protect the entire thing such that any of these settings to be changed, you must have the admin password to go ahead and log in and change any of these toggles. So most of these settings on the General tab are the basic permissions for working around the application. On the Geodetic tab, this is where we start getting into some of the actual geodetics of the application rather than just how stuff is actually stored and accessed. So there are a few settings in here, and these are, if you're an IT user and you're wondering about some of these settings, you probably want to be consulting with any geodesist or the sort of head surveyor, depending on what type of a group you're with, for how to set these. These are defaults that are not often changed in the absence of somebody with some geodetic authority at your company. The settings here are fairly specific. The first setting that is very actually common for some folks to turn on, which disallows the use of a blank transformation. So basically it requires a datum transformation to be selected, a positive transformation, rather than just saying don't do a transformation when going between any systems. The second setting there is a very specific setting for users who are working with 3D transformations. So whether a horizontal datum transformation is allowed to be done in the three-dimensional context. So whether something like a 3-parameter Molodensky transformation would be allowed to modify the z of a particular horizontal coordinate. The third setting here that I actually have in place on my machine is to disable two-step transformations. So there are a number of transformations that are defined as one-step transformations, and then there are other ways to connect the dots between systems that are done in 2 steps, and the application will actually hunt those ways out. Many of them are unofficial transformations. Depending on where you are, the enterprise that you're working in, you may or may not want to see those automatically generated transformations. So for my example here, I've got that one actually set in place. Manual transformations are a very specific one, whether or not you are allowed to arbitrarily scale and rotate the data that you're working with. But the entire geodetic panel here is where we're addressing very, very specific operations that do have a direct geodetic risk or ability, depending on how you're looking at a particular combination. Next up, we have the filtering tab of the admin settings. And this is where most of the common changes are made in place within the administrative settings context. So almost everybody sets 1 or 2 things on the general tab, and then we actually get into the specifics on the filtering tab. Now, the filtering tab is one of the newer tabs as we've reworked the way this dialog interacts. We've added a number of things that can be filtered out. For those of you who are familiar with at least the last several versions of the application, you're going to find the data source views filters on this tab, and that is primarily where in the past we have simply added the on or off settings for particular objects in the data source. So that's where we come to hide things like particular units, particular coordinate systems, regardless of where on the planet they're used. The other filtration settings that are in place based on where a particular coordinate system is or where a transformation is used on the planet, those have moved to the next tab we'll be taking a look at, the Area of Use tab. So one of the major things that we've added to this new tab, along with the basic on or off filters, are the ability to filter out the methods that are used for new coordinate systems and custom coordinate system creation. So you'll notice the majority of this tab is taken up with various filters for projection methods, horizontal transformation methods, and as well vertical transformation methods. So these are not specific coordinate systems, but these are actually the methods that are available in the drop-downs when creating customized data. So we'll take a quick look at exactly where those are going to come up in just a few minutes. The next settings, the area of use settings, these have been largely split off from the filtering settings. They used to live right next to each other. The area of use settings are where we're grouping all of the admin tools, the showing or hiding filters that specifically relate to a spatial definition of where a particular coordinate system or any geodetic object or transformation, where on the planet those actually take place. So we're going to take a look at the filtering tab and the area of use tab to see exactly how those things interrelate with each other. So I'm going to come back to the filtering tab, and we're gonna start out with some basic filters, and then we're gonna hop over to the area of use tab, and we'll actually add in some geographically based filters. So on the filtering tab, the set data source view filters is where we go for some simple on or off filters for displaying various things in the database. So I'm going to go ahead and click into this dialog, and what comes up is a dialog that looks a lot like the dialogs we use to select coordinate systems or transformations, but we actually have some extra tools in here, and it's organized a little bit differently. We see different folders when we come into this view. On the left-hand side of the panel, you're going to see folders of all the different distinct types of geodetic parameter objects. So we have everything from angular and linear units to horizontal datums, transformations, and coordinate systems, all right in this one master dialog. This is primarily going to be used for simply turning things on or off. So the example I very commonly use is angular units for this. So when we click on angular units, you'll see a list of about a dozen different angular units that we can select in the context of either things like convergence angles, or things like degrees, minutes, and seconds for lat-long values, whether we're using degrees or grads or radians, any of the other variations, things like arc minutes and seconds. And this is one place where a lot of users don't actually commonly work with any of these alternate units. Many folks like to streamline this down to just degrees and radians, and a lot of folks do like to streamline this just down to degrees. So the way the filtering dialogues work here is when we go to select an angular unit, you'll see this list of a dozen different angular units that are included out of the box with the database. So let's say, for example, we only want to show just degrees when it comes time to select these particular units. What we can do is use the controls at the bottom. There is a show all and hide all control that makes this very fast to quickly hide a lot of things. What I will typically do in here is say hide all the objects and then just go back and turn on degrees, or if we want to turn on, say, degrees and maybe radians, we can turn those on individually. So I'll just turn on degrees and radians here, and I'm going to OK that into my view file. And so again, remember, the view file is one of the configuration files that lives in that settings directory, and this governs how my end users actually see the contents of the database. So I'm going to go ahead and save that in place, and I'm going to OK all the way out of the admin settings. So here I am back on our interactive job, and for the latitude longitude based systems that I have for both input and output here, you'll see I can select the units that we're going to be specifying those in. So for my example, I was actually working with degrees, but let's just say I wanted to go select a unit. I double click on that box, and the dialog that comes up, instead of having all 12 of those particular units, I only see the 2 that have been handpicked by my admin user. So I just have degrees and radians, or whatever the sub list of those items you want are going to be. By reducing the number of choices, you reduce the potential for very often just making a silly mistake, accidentally clicking on the wrong thing. Now, that was a very simple example. That's just filtering out one of, a few of just a dozen different angular units. So I'm going to come back into this dialog, and we'll just talk quickly about some of the other examples that these are very commonly applied to. So let's take a look down under coordinate systems. Now, the coordinate systems category contains a number of subcategories. So we have engineering coordinate systems in the fitted category, we have Earth-centered, Earth-fixed geocentric systems, we have geodetic and projected systems. So now under each of these categories, we've actually got hundreds and hundreds of possible selections in here. This is one of the places where there are a lot of choices to make that can go wrong if you have users who say just don't have the geodetic experience to be able to properly select the particular coordinate systems that are applicable to their work or to certain parts of the planet. There are also a number of academic definitions that come out of things like the EPSG database that just simply aren't commonly used anymore. And so depending on who you are, what company you happen to be working for, you might want to shut some of these off. The common example we talk about frequently, the very first company that talked to us about implementing these was a Canadian company. And their users had a very, very narrow focus. They were focused only specifically in the region of Alberta in Canada. And so those users, the things they wanted to filter out were the coordinate systems that were covering the rest of the world. So essentially, what they wanted to do was shut off anything that was not covering the Alberta region of Canada. And so we can either come through and hide these individually, or we can actually hide them at the folder level. And so just real quick on how to filter these out by folder, let's just say, for example, I am that Canadian user and I don't have any operations on the continent of Africa. I can simply right-click on that folder and I can say, let's hide the entire thing. When we click Hide by folder, you'll see all of the text goes italicized on the folder name, and then all of the individual objects in that folder, the text is also italicized. That's just a quick trigger to indicate that those are being hidden as a part of the entire folder rather than on an individual basis. And so you can actually fine-tune this quite a bit by filtering at the folder level or filtering down at the specific object level. So when I go back out to select a particular coordinate system, instead of seeing the full list here, any of those italicized folders will simply be completely invisible to the end user. If something is invisible to the end user in the dialogues, they simply cannot select it by accident or through just a poor choice of picking an unfamiliar name. Okay, so let's go ahead and just simply turn that one back on. I'm just going to say show folder. There they are. They're all showing up with their normal text indicating that those are not hidden, but that just gives you an idea of the types of things that can be hidden. So you can very drastically streamline your end user's interaction with this database by pulling out folders, pulling out particular coordinate systems, particular datums, particular transformations, the things that you would like to keep them from using. You can use that both as a streamlining mechanism to really pare that down, to make it a lot easier to find what you're looking for. There are 5,000 coordinate systems in this database, and so for most users, they don't have a need for all of those individual systems to be visible to them on a daily basis. If you want to both guide your user into the correct pool of objects that they should be working with, or simply prevent the accidental selection of something inappropriate, you can take advantage of these on or off filters. So it's one of the very easy ways to take advantage of that. These are saved in the view file, so every time we make a change in there, it's going to ask us if we want to save that into our view file. And so I'm going to go ahead and save that to just turn those all back on. Now the projection types and the horizontal transformation types, this list allows us to filter out the methods that are available to an end user that has permissions to create new objects. I know that's a lot to think about, but the way this breaks down, I'm going to just step out of our admin panel here. I'm going to go under the data source panel and take a look at coordinate system definitions real quick. So let's say I'm going to create a new coordinate system here. I'm just going to drop down under our projected list, and I'm going to go ahead and click the plus button to add a new system. And up pops a blank coordinate system editor. I'm going to skip all of the other stuff that we can get into another time with what goes in here. I'm going to move over to the definition panel, and I'm going to take a look at the projection list. So this drop-down list here has all of those different methods of projection that we saw on the filtering dialog in the admin panel. Now there are a lot of coordinate system projection types available in this list, and for some users, you simply want to reduce those choices as well as taking out some of the systems themselves. So in our admin panel, let's just hop back in there. In our admin panel on the filtering, these methods, by unchecking those, you'll actually see those disappear from the new coordinate system editor or the choices that are available if you're editing an existing custom coordinate system. So the top box there contains all of the projection types for editing. The middle box has all of the horizontal transformations, so for going between one datum and another, one geodetic coordinate system and another, all of the various methods, such as the 3 and 7 parameter methods, various grid-based methods, time-based methods, and a number of specialty methods that we have in here as well. Some users like to streamline that list such that your end users only see just a few of those, because sometimes folks can honestly be confused by having so many options So if you have somebody who's a little bit light on geodetic experience, but you need to be able to give them the ability to add in a new customized projection, sometimes it helps them out to streamline some of their options in here. Again, down at the bottom, similar filtration for the various vertical datum transformation types. There are a number of specialty geoid types that are used around the world. Certain countries' methods have been standardized on by other countries. The Australian geoid model that's in place here, the US Geoid 96 model is actually used by a few different countries around the world. And so if you're going to give your users the ability to add specific geoid types in there as well, sometimes it'll help those folks to have to make a few less choices as they're trying to get in those custom transformation types. So the filtering tab has a lot of very powerful tools for just simply showing or hiding specific objects or specific methods from the end user. Those are simply on or off filters, so you can either see it or you can't. The area of use tab gets a little bit more complicated because here we're actually talking about spatial filtration. This is where we use the areas of use that are defined for all of these coordinate systems, all of these various entities that we have in the geodetic database. The main function on here is to edit the custom areas of use. That is a very powerful tool that a lot of folks, particularly at large enterprises, working in sometimes very sensitive areas, need to use very specific transformations or very specific coordinate systems for those regions. So the Edit Custom Areas of Use dialog is going to take us to a map control. And I'll just make this a little bit bigger here so we can actually see what's going on. And then we'll zoom in just a touch. So you'll see this map control comes out of the box with some extra polygons overlaid here. So the gray and black base map in the background is just simply our basic reference map that you'll also see applied in the selection dialogues when we're picking transformations or picking coordinate systems based on the map. This version of the dialog allows us to apply filters onto that base map. So what this allows us to do is compare the data that the end user is loading in, figure out where on the planet they're working, and then apply some extra filters to the data based on that geography. So the example we're going to come back to again here is my simple conversion on my interactive job, which contains a single point found here in the region of Maine. So what I'm going to do is take my selection tool, and I'm simply going to select this polygon that I have surrounding the continental US. A secondary dialog comes up. It allows us to name that polygon. It allows us to set a priority if we actually have overlapping polygons, which I know some of our larger enterprise customers have overlapping priority levels for certain filters that they have in place. But the main thing here is the area of use filters themselves. So I'm going to go ahead and click Set Up Filters. And this is going to take us into a very similar dialog to the on or off filters that we were just looking at. These filters are going to only be applied within the bounds of that polygon. So I'm going to take a look under single transformations here. We're going to go find that NAD27 to NAD83 transformation that I saw on our very first step here. So I'm going to take a look down under the datum transformations, and you'll see I've got a couple of custom transformations in my database just that I've been playing with a little bit. That's what those are. You shouldn't see those in your own data source. What I'm going to do is search out under the datum list. I'm going to search out transformations relating to NAD27 using the search field at the bottom of the interface here. So what returns for me is a long list of ways to get from NAD27 to other datums, and most of these examples are going to be going to NAD83 or to WGS84. Now, at the very beginning, when we were looking up the methods to get between NAD27 and NAD83 for the point that I had in, one of the options was this Canadian method right here. It was an NTV2-1 method. This is actually The method itself is newer for the Geographic Calculator. We just added this in here fairly recently, but it is actually an older superseded method. So we added this one in here for historical purposes, and I'm just going to use it as an example. So as a part of my filter, we'll see that in that area of the continental US, this particular transformation is allowed to be available. Now, I don't necessarily want my users to be able to pick that, so all I need to do is toggle that off. And that's it. I'm going to say OK. That's going to bring me back out to our main viewer. I'm going to say OK. I like the modification I've done to that particular filter. And then I can close all the way out of the custom areas of use. It's going to note that I have made an edit in there. If you've modified any settings in there, it's going to prompt you to save those settings. So I'm going to go ahead and say yes. Let's put that in place, and I'm going to back all the way out to my initial interactive conversion job here, and I'm going to do our first step again. I'm just going to double click on this coordinate transformation box, and now what comes up is the single method that I have reduced to be available within this area. You might have noticed in that particular envelope, I had reduced a lot of the other methods as well. So I had already pre-screened a lot of those. And we actually do apply some of these custom level filters out of the box with the Geographic Calculator. Just as some extra help beyond what comes with the EPSG areas of use for these transformations. So those types of spatial filters can be applied to horizontal datum use, coordinate systems, and as well transformations, as we see in this case here. What that has the effect of doing is allowing the administrative level user to streamline the choices the end user has to make. You can weed out methods that you're not wanting to use at your particular enterprise. You can weed out lower accuracy transformations that might be valid for some purposes, but not for others. And it basically just allows you to speed up the interaction your end users have to both eliminate mistakes, but also guide proper choices. So to wrap this all up, basically to bring this together, the next thing we're going to just finish up with is talking about how to move these settings around. So once we've got our various admin settings in place that we've taken care of under the administrative settings panel, we have these various concerns like the workspace file, the data source file, where we're going to store those, etc. Most of these are going to be actually stored in the workspace file itself, and that's why this ability to lock the workspace file is such a key setting. Most of the work for this actually is going to take place under the Preferences dialog. The locks are simply set here in the admin panel, but the actual locations of these are governed as user preferences. So we're just going to close up again by looking at these preferences within the file locations. So now let's say, for example, we're trying to share these out on a network location. You as the admin user are going to set up all of the restrictions in place that you would like to have. You're going to store that workspace wherever you want to put it. If that's going to be out on a network location, the easiest way to do that is to simply save it to that location rather than trying to go into our settings directory and grabbing all the files and copying them over manually. There are actually a lot of files here that make up the combined workspace and all of the end user settings. So the easiest way to do that as an admin user is going to be under the file menu. You're simply going to use the save as control up there. So you're going to say save as workspace, and you're going to pick a location for that workspace to go. If that's out on a shared network resource, that's fine. If you're going to put that simply on your own local machine, that's also fine. If you're going to be copying that around as an IT function, if you're going to be pushing that out to individual machines, there are a number of ways to go about moving these various files around. The simplest way is to use save as. Put that out on your shared network resource that you're going to have your end users be feeding into if you are going to be relying on that shared network resources. And the preferences then, you simply need to set within the end user preferences to always load that particular workspace. So once you've saved it off to your shared network resource, you're just going to browse to that, and you're going to say always load that particular workspace. If you're going to move your data source file and your custom data source file, those you can actually just simply drag and drop wherever you'd like to put them, as long as you set those locations appropriately. The data source file is stored in its normal default location. To copy the data source file, you do simply just need to grab all of the contents of that folder and move them to whatever location you want them to be in. The only tricky part of this is if you're actually planning on keeping your custom file in a separate location, there is a couple of files here that we need to keep together. So the geodata file, the geodata XML, and the geodata XVW, those typically live together. They don't need to. There is also a user preference on having a custom view file location. But the main thing here is this geocalc.xsd. If you are going to be splitting the location of your custom data source and your geodata.xml data source, that XSD file, that's what's called a schema file, and that basically just allows an application to properly read an XML file. That schema file just simply needs to be copied into the locations of both of those database files. So like I mentioned, it is most common for users to keep the complete data source package together, but there are a number of ways that this can be configured. That's probably starting to get into a little bit of the overly specific realm for this session. And what I would encourage is, if you do have some very particular questions about how you want to set your file locations up, which admin switches you want to put in place, I would definitely encourage you to contact our tech support team. They can be reached at geohelp@bluemarblegeo.com. You can find links into our support group as well on our main website, bluemarblegeo.com. Any questions that you have relating to this are often very specific if you're talking about administrative controls on the application. I'd like to thank everyone for watching this video. You can subscribe to our new channel here for updates as we release new videos. We will be continuing on our monthly schedules with releasing new videos. Keep the questions coming. They are what informs the topics that we cover on these sessions. We like making content that people like to actually watch and learn from. So send those questions into geohelp@bluemarblegeo.com. Thank you for joining me for this session, and we'll see you next time.